welcome to everyone who's been able to join us today. Thank you very much. My name is Gabby Nagel, and I do the community outreach and marketing for gettinghired.com. Welcome to our webinar today, which is on managing disability in the workplace and using JAN, or the Job Accommodation Network. I'll just run through a few quick logistics to make sure everyone can access all the information okay. So hopefully you can hear me all right. You can access the audio through dialing the phone number and using the conference code, which are also in the chat box. If you have any questions at all during the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat window on the right of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, we'll get to them and hopefully be able to go through them all. As with all of our webinars, we have a live captioning service, and the link is posted also in the chat box, so you can just click it to access that. We'll be recording this presentation and uploading it onto the Getting Hired YouTube channel next week. We'll also email all of the registrants a copy of this presentation and a link to the recorded webinar as well. You may have noticed during the presentation that everyone is set to mute, so do feel free to use the chat box for any questions you have at all during the presentation. It's also useful for us to know if there are any topics around career development or disability employment in general that could be really useful for you in your job search. So you should get some questions at the end of the presentation coming up on your screen. So please do let us know how we did and if there's anything we could improve upon. It's always really useful to know. If for any reason you're unable to access the chat window for your questions, you can also email them directly to me at gnagel@gettinghired.com. So that's GNAGLE @gettinghired.com. And you can also send any feedback you have, questions, comments, suggestions. Feel free to send those too. I'd also just like to quickly thank our two sponsors today, two of the Getting Hired employer partners. We have a global biopharma leader, BMS, Bristol Myers Squibb, who has opportunities in many departments around the world, including research and development jobs, as well as marketing, sales, manufacturing, corporate jobs, and finance jobs. You can have a look at all their jobs listed on Getting Hired, which is fully accessible. We also have Infosys, which is a leading provider of next-generation consulting, technology, and outsourcing solutions. They have openings for project managers, business analysts, tech architects or programmers, sales and consultants, lawyers, accountants, and HR leaders. So you can find both of those on Getting Hired and apply to anything that's of interest. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Tracy DeFreitas, who is the lead consultant for the Job Accommodation Network. With more than 20 years of experience in the disability employment field, Tracy supports all JAN specialty teams as lead consultant and Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, specialist. She provides expert disability-related federal employment law and workplace accommodation consultation regarding a broad range of medical impairment and ADA issues. Tracy is an experienced national speaker and author who specializes in ADA Title I compliance and the interactive accommodation process. So thank you so much for joining us today, Tracy.
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you to Getting Hired for including Jan today. I'm happy to be here.
Great, our pleasure. So I'm just going to give Tracy the control so she can, there we go. And Tracy, feel free to kick off whenever you're ready.
All right, great, here we go. So welcome everyone. I'm speaking with you from the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN. We're located in Morgantown, West Virginia. One of my goals today is to tell you all about the JAN service so that you'll be informed about how to access the free services our organization offers. I'll also offer a brief primer on the Title I employment provisions of the ADA and explain how to leverage the ADA to request accommodations at work. And then finally, I'll discuss disability disclosure and explain the process of requesting reasonable accommodation on the job. Using all of this information will enable individuals to manage disability-related issues at work. And by talking about managing disability today, we're exploring if and how and when disability affects employment and ways to leverage the ADA and accommodation tools and resources to minimize work-related barriers by requesting accommodation. So let's get started with some information about JAN. I'm hoping that some of you are familiar with the service or have used it before. It's a service that's been available for quite some time now. JAN was established in 1983 as a national free consulting service that provides expert consultation on job accommodation solutions for individuals with disabilities in all industries, in all job categories, and for all types of medical impairments and limitations. Another main objective that we have is to provide targeted technical assistance regarding federal laws like the ADA as amended and the Rehabilitation Act, and also a little bit on the Family and Medical Leave Act as well. We don't offer legal advice, but we can explain employers' responsibilities and individuals' rights under these workplace non-discrimination laws. Nationally, JAN actually represents the most comprehensive resource for job accommodation information and technical assistance on the Title I employment provisions of the ADA. The service is funded by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP, but the organization is not a federal agency. We do operate out of West Virginia University in Morgantown, West Virginia, but we do serve people who contact us from all over the country and actually even the world. We do receive contacts from people in other countries as well. But of course, our main focus is here in the United States, and we are talking to a lot of people across the country. I do need to make it clear that JAN is not a job placement service. We don't assist individuals in the employment search process. We do offer resources related to job placement, and we often refer to organizations like gettinghired.com so that people can seek out assistance from agencies that do help with that, but we do typically refer folks to those resources for this type of assistance. So just keep that in mind. We're here more as a resource to provide accommodation and ADA information than to help with the search process. Anyone can contact JAN for information. We primarily serve employers and individuals with disabilities, but also receive contacts from legal, educational, rehabilitation, medical, and other professionals who are seeking ADA and accommodation information, as well as family members and friends of individuals with disabilities also. So when you contact JAN, you'll communicate with an experienced JAN consultant who will offer individualized one-on-one consultation related to your specific concerns. Our consultants are highly educated, they're well-rounded, dedicated problem solvers, and they all specialize in a particular area. So when you contact JAN, if you know the medical impairment or the limitation involved, or have a specific question or ADA accommodation question or ADA question, the information will be used to connect you with the most appropriate specialist. So the more you know, the better we can help you. Our consultants specialize in motor mobility impairment, cognitive, psychiatric, and sensory and immunology-related impairments, as well as ADA, and also we have an entrepreneurship team as well, helping people with resources related to establishing a small business. We handle around 50,000 contacts per year, so we do stay very busy. We're not a large organization. There are about 10 to 12 consultants who are handling these cases, so we do stay very busy. When you contact JAN, we meet you where you are in the process of gathering information about accommodations in the ADA. We explain the interactive accommodation process. This is a process that's used in employment to explore and implement reasonable accommodation in the workplace. We offer technical assistance, as I mentioned, related to your specific ADA issues. We can brainstorm ideas and provide accommodation solutions based on our experience. We share comprehensive resources, and of course, we always maintain confidentiality. Our service is entirely confidential, so you can feel comfortable speaking with us about any issues that you would like related to your employment situation. Your information won't be shared with anyone. So And thanks to your tax dollars, all of the services that Jan provides are completely free of charge, which is not easy to find nowadays. So we're available for you to serve you without any cost involved. Jan does offer an extraordinary number of accommodation and ADA resources through our AskJan.org website, including Jan-authored publications, resources that can be found by disability, topic, or limitation. We also have legal libraries with Equal Employment Opportunity Commission regulations, free training modules, access to social media. We have a blog, a quarterly e-news. It's really a fantastic site, so I encourage everyone to use AskJan.org. It can be overwhelming at first, but a really great place to start on the site is the A to Z of Disabilities section. This is a section of our site that we're constantly building, and this is where you can search by disability, topic, or limitation. We're adding to those topics daily. We're adding to those disabilities daily, so it is something that is just a resource that's constantly evolving. Jan contact information can be found on the right side of the home page. There you can even access our online live chat feature to talk with a consultant, which is a pretty popular feature. So that's really just sort of my quick Jan infomercial. If there are any questions about the Jan service, you can feel free to send them through the chat now, and we'll go ahead and address those a little bit later on. Let's get started talking about a little bit more here related to disability and work. And, you know, it's important to know if, and if so, how disability affects work. Having an understanding of this coupled with knowledge about the Americans with Disabilities Act and accommodations can really lead to greater success on the job. Of course, not everyone with a medical impairment will need accommodations. Those that do should be prepared to request accommodations at work, though, when the time is right, and we'll get into that a little bit here as we proceed. It's really vitally important to have at least a basic understanding of your reasonable accommodation needs and employment rights under Title I of the ADA. As I mentioned earlier, these are the employment provisions of the law, or Section 501 of the Rehabilitation Act for those of you that would be employed by federal government agencies. The ADA and the Rehab Act mirror each other, so the regulations are almost identical, not exactly identical, but very close. There are some requirements that the federal government has that private employers don't have, and vice versa. So, but for the most part, when it comes to reasonable accommodation and anti-discrimination, you're looking at the same thing. So really, what is the ADA? I've used the term Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, multiple times already, but let's just talk a little bit about, in brief, you know, what the Title I basic principles are. Title I applies to private employers who employ 15 or more employees. It also applies to state and local governments, employment agencies, and labor unions as well. Smaller employers don't fall under the ADA, but could be protected by similar state laws that are enforced by state human rights agencies. The ADA prohibits discrimination in all employment practices, job application, hiring, firing, advancement, compensation, training activities, even benefits and privileges of employment as well. And so this means that the requirements not to discriminate based on disability and the requirements to provide reasonable accommodation apply during every stage of the employment life cycle. So at any stage, whether it's the beginning or the end or the middle, the ADA is going to apply. Discrimination is prohibited against qualified individuals with disabilities. And a qualified individual with a disability is someone who possesses the qualifications and the skills and the certifications that are needed for the job, and who is also able to perform all the essential functions of the job, either with or without an accommodation. So you must be able to perform the essential duties in order to be a qualified individual. Employers are required to provide reasonable accommodation when it is known that an individual has a disability and needs accommodation, and when the accommodation doesn't create an undue hardship. The reasonable accommodation duty, it's a fundamental statutory requirement of the ADA. However, it is up to the individual with a disability to make it known to the employer that an accommodation is needed. Employers aren't expected to assume or guess that accommodations are needed. And we'll get into a little bit more about that in some greater detail here as we move forward as well. So some of you might be wondering, who is a person with a disability? Who's considered to have a disability under the ADA? Well, some of you are probably familiar with the ADA Amendments Act, or the ADAAA, as it's sometimes referred to. This law amended the original ADA. The ADAAA led to a change in the way the definition of disability is interpreted, so that there's now a less demanding standard to meet. Previously, under the original ADA, it was actually quite difficult to be considered a person with a disability. But now with the ADAAA, the definition of disability didn't change, but some of the words within the definition are sort of interpreted in a different way. The term disability is defined in general terms rather than with a list of medical conditions. And so someone has a disability if they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And I would say that's the prong of the definition that we deal with the most. The second prong is a person who has a record of a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And the third prong is somebody who's regarded as having a physical or mental impairment, again, that substantially limits major life activities. For the purpose of determining disability to receive accommodation under the ADA, we need to know, is there an impairment, and if the impairment limits that individual substantially in one way or another. Those are the two main ways of kind of assessing disability. The term substantially limits, it's not supposed to be construed in a very strict way. It should be construed broadly in favor of expansive coverage. So it's not meant to be a demanding standard. An impairment is a disability if it limits the ability of an individual to perform major life activities as compared to most people, not just those that have a similar type of impairment. So this is sort of, you know, the general definition and what we need to remember when we're thinking about who has a disability. There's no comprehensive list of covered impairments under the ADA. A lot of times people will call and say, well, is this particular disability a disability? And we really can't answer that question. It's something that you have to look at on a case-by-case basis. However, there are some kinds of impairments that will virtually always result in a determination of disability, and these are what's known as predictable assessments. So, for example, impairments like deafness, blindness, someone who has an intellectual disability, someone who might be missing a limb, autism, cancer, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, HIV. These are just examples of impairments that should be easily found to substantially limit a major life activity of some kind. So for the most part, individuals who do have these kinds of impairments are generally going to fall under the ADA. Again, this is not a comprehensive list of any kind. These are simply examples, so keep that in mind. So to determine if an individual has a disability, an employer may request sufficient medical information to substantiate the disability and the need for the accommodation. And this is when the impairment is not known or obvious. We're not going to get into too much detail around that. Medical inquiry rules are a little bit complicated, and I believe we're going to do a session on that next month sometime. So if you're interested in more of that, keep that in mind. But from an individual standpoint, if you're going to request an accommodation, you do need to be prepared to offer medical information if it's requested. For applicants who might be requesting accommodation to participate in the hiring process, an employer may request limited medical information. Employers are generally not permitted to ask medical questions prior to an offer of employment, but if you're requesting an accommodation for the hiring process, you need to be prepared to justify the need for that accommodation. And so an applicant could be asked to provide a note from an appropriate professional that indicates the individual has the medical impairment and requires accommodation. Ultimately, an employer decides when an individual meets the ADA's definition of disability. And so what they do is they review information provided by the individual and their healthcare provider. When they're not sure, we kind of encourage them to err on the side of caution and process a request for accommodation. It just sort of, the EEOC has made it clear that employers should focus more on whether or not an accommodation can be provided as opposed to figuring out if the person has a substantially limiting disability. But the employer has a right to do that. For more on this, you can go to the askjan.org website under the A to Z section and look by topic under medical exams and inquiries. Now, individuals with disabilities who understand the basic principles of the ADA are going to going into employment, they'll really be better able to leverage the legislation to, when necessary, ask for what's needed to enable success on the job. And for many people, one of the most difficult questions to answer is when or whether to disclose disability and request accommodation. And deciding if, when, and how to share disability-related information with a prospective employer or a current employer can really be kind of overwhelming. And the decision-making process requires answering a number of personal questions that may be different with each employment experience. There's no single right or wrong approach. The process can include questions like, do I have an obligation to disclose? When's the right time? How much information does the employer need? How will disclosing the information affect my employment? So these are the sorts of questions that might come to mind when you're thinking about telling an employer about a disability. Generally, there's no obligation to disclose disability-related information to an employer until the need for reasonable accommodation becomes apparent. Disability disclosure can occur during any stage of the employment process, including pre-employment, post-offer, and while employed, whether it's within days of being employed or months or years of initially being hired. And generally, it is up to the individual, as I mentioned earlier, with the disability to determine the right time to disclose their disability and request accommodation if needed, given his or her particular circumstances. So there's not really a right or wrong or black and white answer to whether or not you should disclose. Why disclose? Well, usually when an accommodation is needed, or to receive benefits or privileges of employment, or to explain an unusual circumstance. For example, when there's a performance issue that's affected by disability, or an individual is behaving in an unusual manner and the employer has noticed this, those are times where disclosure typically occurs. The need to disclose or request accommodation will become evident when an individual knows there's a workplace barrier related to a disability. So once that knowledge is there, then you can think about whether or not it's something you need to do. There are some tips to keep in mind. The timing of a request can be rather important. It's not necessary to disclose a disability if sharing the information will have no impact on the employment situation. So I just realized I might be on the wrong slide here. I apologize. Okay. So if an accommodation is not needed, it's probably not necessary to disclose a hidden disability that'll have no impact on job performance. Also, on the other side of that, it is better to disclose a disability and request accommodation before job performance suffers in some way or conduct problems occur, because you want to let the employer know what's going on and try to figure out accommodation solutions that are going to improve performance or that will help you meet conduct standards. According to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, an employer does not have to rescind discipline, including a termination or an evaluation that's warranted by poor performance simply because an employee has disclosed a disability or requested accommodation. So if you do that ahead of time and help prevent some of those problems, then you're going to be in a better position. So we understand that accommodations must be provided under the ADA, but what does accommodation really mean? It's reasonable accommodations, any change or adjustment to a job or the work environment that permits a qualified applicant with a disability to participate in the job application process, or an employee to perform the essential functions of the job, or even to enjoy benefits and privileges of employment that are similar to those received by others. An accommodation is essentially a change in the way things are usually done that enables an individual to perform essential job duties when medical limitations affect performance. The duty to accommodate is an ongoing one. There's no limit to the number of requests that must be considered. And there are 3 categories of accommodation. So let's take a look at that. It can include modifications or adjustments to a job application process. So like I talked about earlier, that life cycle when you're starting at the very beginning, it might be an interpreter for an interview or testing modifications. It can be modifications to the work environment, like installing an automatic door, providing accessible parking, or maybe a change in how the work is customarily performed, where the job might be restructured, equipment might be needed, that kind of thing. Or it can be modifications or adjustments that enable the enjoyment of equal benefits and privileges of employment, like access to a cafeteria or break room or participating in training, et cetera. So there are lots of situations where an accommodation might come in. I noted earlier that only a qualified individual with a disability is entitled to receive accommodations. This can apply to applicants, part-time or full-time, even probationary employees, and also individuals who have a record of an impairment but who are not currently substantially limited can be entitled to accommodation. For example, an individual who is in remission from cancer and who may need to attend follow-up annual medical appointments for the cancer-related situation. This person might be entitled to intermittent time off or schedule modification if needed because of his or her disability, because of the record of that impairment. Accommodation is not required for individuals who are only regarded as having a disability because they do not have an actual disability. And then accommodations are not required for caregivers of individuals with disabilities. The accommodation provision of the ADA only applies to a person with the disability. So although those who have an association with a person with a disability can't be discriminated against, accommodations are not typically permitted or afforded to individuals who are caring for an individual with a disability, and we do get that question quite a bit, actually. So here's some examples of ADA principles that are related to employer responsibilities that you just want to be aware of. Employers don't have to provide accommodations unless needed because of a disability. So if you don't have a disability, there's no legal obligation to provide an accommodation under the ADA. Employers don't have to provide accommodations that pose an undue hardship to the employer, which is basically a modification that would cause significant difficulty or expense to provide. And employers have the right to choose among effective accommodations. So this means they don't have to provide the exact accommodation that's requested. If there's an alternative effective solution and that's less burdensome, an employer can choose to provide that type of accommodation as long as it is effective. It is, of course, suggested that employers consider individual preference when they are looking at accommodation. And so, we do suggest if the individual has ideas, you want to present those, and you want to explain why you feel as though that's the best solution to consider. But keep in mind that an employer can choose among other effective options if necessary. Personal use items needed in accomplishing daily activities both on and off the job. For example, medically prescribed hearing aids, eyeglasses, wheelchairs, these are items that are not required as accommodation. Of course, employers do not have to accommodate an individual who's not otherwise qualified for a position. And so the individual has to be qualified and able to perform the essential duties, or they're not going to be able to stay in that position. And finally, employers do not have to remove essential job functions. They don't have to create new jobs, and they don't have to lower production standards as accommodation. So these are just some things that you want to keep in mind when you're thinking about discussing accommodation. Now I'd like to talk about the process of requesting accommodations. What is a reasonable accommodation request? Well, when an applicant or an employee asks for an adjustment or change at work for a reason related to a medical condition, there must be a connection between the medical impairment and the work-related issue. When making a request for accommodation under the ADA, according to the EEOC, an individual can use what's known as plain English. They don't have to mention the ADA or use the phrase reasonable accommodation, but they should make it known that a change is needed at work because of a reason related to a medical impairment. There's got to be that connection there. A request for accommodation does not have to be made in writing, but Jan always recommends a written request, and also EEOC suggested as well. They suggest that it may be found to be useful to document the request in the event there's a dispute about whether or when a request was made or an individual actually disclosed his disability. It's good to get it documented. And one way to document it is to just simply make a written request, whether it's through email or just a letter to the employer. It's up to you how to do that. Jan does offer a sample accommodation request letter that can assist in this process, and it is available on our website. It's called Ideas for Writing an Accommodation Request Letter. When an individual is prepared to disclose his or her disability because an accommodation is needed, the individual should inform someone who can actually act on that request. So you're not going to make it of a coworker. You're going to make a request to a manager, supervisor, maybe someone in HR, human resources. So make sure you seek out an appropriate individual to request that accommodation through. After the disclosure and the request for accommodation is made, then the interactive process is supposed to begin. And this is where there is a collaborative interaction to explore and implement reasonable accommodations together with the employer. And this is something that is required. There are no specific guidelines or forms for requesting reasonable accommodation under the ADA. However, some employers do have in-house ADA forms, and they can ask employees to complete these forms when an accommodation is requested. Anyone who chooses to write an accommodation request letter on their own, however, might consider including some of this information on this slide. So you want to identify yourself as a person with a disability by providing information about your medical impairment, how it affects you, and your ability to perform job duties. It's important to state that you're requesting accommodations under the ADA or the Rehab Act, if that makes sense if you're a federal employee, so that your intentions are clear. The employer doesn't have to guess why you're writing them this letter. You want to identify your specific problematic job tasks. So how is your medical impairment affecting your work responsibilities? What responsibilities are affected? You'll want to identify your accommodation ideas. If you have ideas, you want to share them. Also, you want to request that your employer offer accommodation ideas as well. So invite them to collaborate with you and discuss possible solutions because it is a collaborative process. You can attach medical documentation if it's appropriate, but keep in mind you're not required to necessarily attach that when you make the request for accommodation. It is okay to do that, but if you'd rather wait until the employer requests it, you can absolutely do that as well. Keep in mind that if you don't attach it, then it's possible you're going to get that request. So just be prepared to go to your medical provider and get the information that's being asked for by the employer. You do want to ask that your employer respond to your request in a reasonable amount of time. There's no set time for an employer to respond under the ADA, but they do have an obligation to respond without delay. So just sort of, prod them a little bit, remind them, hey, I'd like to hear from you in, maybe a week or two, to have some sort of response so that you can collaborate together on this. It is important to send your letter by email or postal service, but make sure that you keep copies for yourself so that you have everything documented and you have a paper trail if that's necessary down the road. So, so there are no comprehensive lists of reasonable accommodations. Accommodation, I tell people, can be just about anything. It's just, think about it as a way of thinking outside of the box and getting things done differently. Each situation will be different, and what's reasonable will vary widely depending on the circumstances, and I'll talk about reasonable here in just a second. But examples of accommodations can be making facilities accessible. Job restructuring is very common, where you're altering when or how certain job functions are performed. Modified or part-time work schedule is very common. Equipment, a lot of times we think about assistive technology. It can be changing tests or training materials or policies, providing readers or interpreters. Reassignment to a vacant position is often sort of a last resort type accommodation, but in some situations it's a great solution. Medical leave, it can be an accommodation, and also working from home. Keep in mind, these are just simply examples, some of the most common, and we'll talk more about that as well. But so it's change. It's something different. It's a unique way of doing things. It's with the objective that with that change, we're going to see a difference in how an individual can perform job duties or benefit from a privilege of some kind in the work environment. A reasonable accommodation is one that seems reasonable on its face. So what does that mean? Well, if it's something that appears to be feasible or plausible, is kind of the way EEOC refers to it. It's essentially up to the employer to determine what's considered reasonable, and this would be based on their resources for providing the accommodation. An accommodation also must be effective in meeting the needs of the individual to perform job duties or participate in hiring or receive a benefit. So the accommodation has to be both reasonable and effective. What's meant by undue hardship? Well, undue hardship is any action that requires significant difficulty or expense to provide, and this might be in relation to the size of the employer, the resources available, and also the nature of the operation. This must always be something that's determined on a case-by-case basis, and so you need to gather as much information as possible to try to figure out whether or not something creates a hardship. You can't just decide, I don't want to do this, or the employer can't just decide that, well, they just don't want to spend the money or anything like that. It really has to be thought through to figure out what is going to be a hardship. Usually cost is not something that can be used to claim hardship because it can be difficult to define that as undue hardship. So when an individual is negotiating accommodations, he or she should keep in mind, is the accommodation something the employer is likely to be able to provide without it being too difficult or burdensome, without it negatively impacting operation of the business and how others perform job duties or how customers are served, and will the accommodation effectively enable the individual to perform essential job duties? So when you're thinking about addressing accommodations with the employer, those are just some of the things that you want to keep in mind. Now, sometimes an individual who is having difficulty at work because of a medical impairment may not know what type of accommodation is needed, and that's okay. Basically, you want to share what's known, your impairment, your limitations, the job-related issues. It's okay to let the employer know that an adjustment or change at work is needed because of your medical impairment, and then let them know that you'd like to discuss accommodation ideas. Then the two parties can explore accommodation options together and share, you can discuss what you know and kind of go from there. Of course, you want to reach out to other resources that can help as well, like Jan, of course, is a good place to start. We're here for you as a free resource. We can brainstorm with you. We can offer you general information as a start. So, maybe you're not really sure where to go with it, but you just need a foundation. You just need some place to start. We can offer our general accommodation publications. And then from there, you can talk more specifics with the employer or with us once you know more information about the situation. A good place to start is the A to Z section that I mentioned earlier on the askjan.org website, or you can just contact us directly and to speak with a consultant. So go to the homepage, access the contact information, and decide whether you want to call or email or use the chat feature on the homepage, whatever works for you. But we're here to help you work through that process. What if an accommodation request is denied? Well, we encourage folks to find out why, if you can. So, for example, if the request was denied because medical information didn't demonstrate disability, is it possible to provide additional information to help that move forward? If the employer decided that the accommodation request would pose an undue hardship, maybe suggest alternative accommodation options so that you can see if there's something else you can come up with. Sometimes an employer is not going to provide any explanation for why. You could ask it, but they aren't necessarily mandated to provide it. Excuse me. If an individual who believes the employer didn't have a valid reason to deny the request could certainly try to appeal the decision. We suggest that you go up the chain of command within your organization. You could file a grievance with a union if that's applicable, or ultimately you have the right to file a formal complaint with the EEOC or State Fair Employment Practice Agency. And you can access information regarding filing a complaint with EEOC on their website, www.eeoc.gov. So if you need more information on how to go about doing that, they do spell it out pretty nicely on their site. So here are just some tips to kind of finish up with the general information here. Tips for individuals to remember with regard to ADA, disclosure, requesting and negotiating accommodation. Remember, it's important to request accommodation before performance suffers, as soon as it's known that an accommodation is needed. You don't want to end up in a situation where things aren't going real well, but and it's heading toward termination. Jan always recommends submitting an accommodation request in writing. So when possible, that's how you want to go about doing that in order to document the request. Don't just make a request and forget about it. I suggest people follow up on the request. If you don't hear back from the employer within a week, give them a call, send them an email. Do what you can to make sure that they are doing what they need to do on their end. It's merely a suggestion, it's not a requirement, but it really is a good idea to check in. I like the email because it documents that you've reached out to them and you've tried to see whether or not they're following through with your accommodation request. If requested by the employer, obtain any requested medical information in a timely manner. The longer it takes for you to get them the information, the longer it's going to take for you to receive an accommodation. So keep in mind that the faster you can do that, the faster you'll be able to get those accommodations in place and hopefully be successful on the job. Come to the table with accommodation solutions and resources. Like Jan, it's better to be prepared with ideas and approach the situation with positive solutions. That way, you can proceed a lot faster that way. And finally, insist that it's important for you to know what your rights are and to be an advocate for yourself so that you're better informed about what your rights are and what you can ask for and receive in the work environment. So that kind of falls on you to make sure that you know what your rights are. You're going to be on your own, so that's what you need to do. So those are just some quick tips here. I'm just going to follow up real quickly with some examples of some of the most common accommodations, and then we'll open it up to questions. And I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but modified and flexible scheduling, I would say, is one of the absolute most common accommodation situations that we deal with. And that can mean a lot of things. It can be adjusting arrival or departure times. It can be asking for periodic breaks throughout the day. It could be having a flexible schedule, providing part-time work in some situations to some degree. It could be changing a work shift or even allowing an employee to use accrued paid leave in some way. Another common accommodation is a modified or a new policy of some kind. This typically comes in where you're modifying attendance and tardiness policies. I talked to a lot of people about that. Food-related policies sometimes come into play when you have someone who has a food allergy in the work environment. Modifying a dress code to allow somebody to wear a different type of clothing than what is normally required. Implementing a fragrance policy or policies related to chemicals in the work environment. And modifying a policy related to working from home. Sometimes employers don't allow that, but they may have to consider it in some situations. Job restructuring, again, I mentioned that a little bit earlier, but it's about sort of changing the way or when certain job functions are performed so that a person with a disability can perform them. It can also be light duty where you're sort of juggling around the functions of the job, maybe temporarily removing certain functions so an individual can heal from an injury or treatment or something like that. But remember, you never have to reallocate essential job functions, but can. An employer has the ability to do that. They just don't have an obligation to do it. Equipment, very common as well. It could be purchasing or modifying or designing equipment for a person with a disability. Some examples like screen magnifying or reading software, iPads with apps on them, desk chairs or adjustable workstations, keyboards, things like that. That really, there's no limit to what that could be. And then leave. Leave is a very common accommodation. The idea behind providing leave is to give someone the time they need in order to get well or seek treatment or do what they need to do so that they can come back to work and be successful on the job. So, I talk to people about leave every single day. So those are just some examples of some of the most common that Jan talks to people about. On this slide here, we have some tools that you may want to tap into. They're hyperlinked through the PowerPoint. These are some tools that might be useful to applicants and employees with regard to requesting accommodation and knowing your ADA rights. Writing the accommodation request letter is also here. So if you need some help there, go ahead and jump into the site and take a look at those, and we can also help you find them as well. So that's about all I have to cover today. It looks like we have some activity over in the chat here, so I'll take a look over here. Gabby, if there's anything in particular you want to throw at me as far as questions,
sure.
I'll do that as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Tracy. That's all really, really valuable information. And, you know, like I've said before, we're asked about these sorts of issues all the time. So, so thank you so much for going through them.
It's a pleasure.
Well, yep, like you said, we do have a few questions. Excuse me. I'll start off with the first one we got here. I do think you've actually answered something around this, but somebody's asking how they're assessed for an ADA accommodation. They're not too sure about what options are available for them, and, you know, how would they go about finding out what options could be useful for them.
Okay, let me, just bear with me a second while I kind of look
Sure.
through this real quickly. That first issue here presented related to an individual who has Asperger's on the autism spectrum. Also, it looks like they have some other impairments going on here as well.
Oh, no, that's, sorry, that's the next question.
Oh,
that's all right. This one, yeah, this one is just, you know, they're just wondering about how they get assessed. And, you know, he says that, well, he or she says that they're, you know, new to this and they don't really know what their accommodation needs are. So, you know, I think it's very much a how do I know what's out there and how can I get access to it. So you've touched on this sort of thing, but, you know, maybe just a couple of starting points of where they could go.
Okay, and so I guess what we're saying then is assessed in terms of the disability and whether they have the disability. Is that where you're going with that?
I think so, yeah. Maybe, I think probably what types of accommodations could be suitable, and, you know, how would they go about finding out which accommodations they would be entitled to, I guess.
Okay, so, you know, when you're trying to figure out what accommodations make sense, you know, there are some basic places to start in terms of, you know, you want to look at what sort of impairment is involved, what limitations are involved, and how that's affecting job performance. In doing that, oftentimes we can kind of figure out, you know, if we're talking about someone, for example, who's having difficulty with organization and memory or concentration, we kind of like take a look at those things and try to assess, okay, how does that affect your ability to perform the function? We can walk you through some of those things and try to figure out what accommodations make sense based on sort of generalized ideas, but then we kind of need to take a look at, well, what is the actual job and what specific functions have to be performed? When are they performed? How are they performed? Are they performed in conjunction with other individuals? So there are a lot of sort of questions that we have to figure out and ask in order to assess that. And we can start in a general sense. Now, there are situations where it might be helpful to have some other individual come into a work environment and assess the situation as well. And I think that that is very much going to depend on the type of impairment that's involved and what sort of local resources and specialists might be available to assess that also. So, for example, in a case where you have somebody who's dealing with technology-related situations, we oftentimes refer to the local assistive technology project who might be able to come in and do an assessment and figure out what the individual's needs are. So it's a lot of sort of, it's definitely a process. It's certainly a lot of back and forth and gathering information to figure out exactly what's happening to then decide what accommodations could be applicable.
Right. That makes sense. And we'll go on to the next question, the one that you were looking at. They've given quite a lot of detail here, but basically it's someone that, you know, has been diagnosed with Asperger's and on the autism spectrum. I think the sum of the issue is that they feel they didn't get the right accommodations, and they feel that they were unfairly dismissed because of their inability to do the job. This person says that they filed a complaint with the OFCCP and EEOC. I don't know what's happening. They didn't go into any more detail about how that's progressing, but I think they're also looking for some advice on how they should address this situation when the person is applying for the next job. So I guess, is there kind of any advice around how they would phrase, you know, why they were fired, and you know, and I guess try to successfully have the right accommodations in the right time frame for the next job?
Okay. That is a very difficult spot to be in, and I'm sorry to hear that this has happened to the individual. You know, whenever an individual is, and Gabby, you might be able to chime in here too from the getting hired standpoint, but whenever somebody is seeking employment after they've left a job or lost a job and there may be some disability-related issues involved, you don't necessarily have to share that's what was going on. It's up to you. That, again, I think comes back to the whole disclosure piece and what you care to share. It can be that an individual, you know, made attempts to be successful on the job but wasn't supported appropriately. I like the word supported because I feel like employers should support their employees, all of them, whether they have disabilities or don't. And when you provide accommodations, hopefully you are supporting individuals, but by indicating that you weren't supported on the job to being able to be successful, that doesn't necessarily throw out disability information. People can be supported in various ways. So if it's just sort of indicating that it didn't work out because you weren't provided the tools and resources you need to perform your job duties effectively, it doesn't disclose disability information. So maybe sort of considering that approach with it, if they're asked the question, you know, why were you let go from that position, then that could be something, because it throws it back on the employer, but it doesn't necessarily share disability-related information necessarily.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that as well. We'll get on to the next question, which is, hang on, just scrolling through them.
A question here related to medical documentation.
Oh, sure, go for it.
Right chat box. Okay. How much medical documentation in detail can the employer require? For example, just verification of a diagnosis, or needing to have more details on that? And that's a really good question. There's not a specific parameter in terms of, well, the employer can only ask for X, Y, and Z. What there is, however, is EEOC makes it clear that an employer is only entitled to what would be considered sufficient medical documentation, which basically means that it indicates the impairment, the limitations involved, and why the accommodation is needed. So you're getting to the bottom of what exists, how does it affect the individual, and what is needed, basically. Ultimately, under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, an employer could probably request the diagnosis. So if an individual is not comfortable offering that right away, we usually suggest starting with a little bit broader information, but hitting the limitations, hitting the specific accommodation needs. Ultimately, they could probably request the diagnosis, but if you're not comfortable sharing that right away, try to give as much other information as possible so that they can figure out how to accommodate you, and then see where it goes from there. You will want to keep in mind, we're speaking from federal law standpoint for the ADA. Some states do have some restrictions on what an employer can ask for in terms of diagnosis, so that is something else to keep in mind. It's not necessarily something you need to know as an individual, but rather an employer needs to be aware of that. So, for example, in California, it's our understanding there are some restrictions on asking for a diagnosis, but again, we're speaking about federal law today.
Right. I hope that clears that up. I found the next question. So somebody's asking, what does it mean, I think they're referring to when we were talking about what's defined as a disability. They're asking, what does it mean regarded as having a disability versus someone having a disability?
Okay. So when someone is regarded as having a disability, they're treated in a way as if they have a disability, but they don't actually have one. So it's as if an employer is treating somebody in a way, let's say that they feel like the individual can't do something because of what they perceive to be a disability. It's like saying, well, because somebody has a broken leg, that individual can't perform certain duties, and so the employer discriminates against them and doesn't want to hire them. And that individual probably usually wouldn't be considered a person with a disability. It's a temporary impairment that is generally not going to be substantially limiting. But if an employer makes a decision not to hire someone on that basis, and they actually could perform the job duties, then they're being regarded as having a disability.
Right. Great. That clarifies that. Sorry, we've got a few questions coming in.
And I'll be honest, I just found some of these questions, so they weren't coming up as the wrong chat box up. So. Oh,
really? No worries.
It looks like I have it now. So.
We've also got one. The person before we were talking about who reported their unfair dismissal to the EEOC or OFCCP. They're just following up with, is there, if you know, if there's a time frame that the EEOC or OFCCP has to basically resolve the complaint or the case?
I would imagine that there is some sort of time frame that they have from a policy standpoint, a procedural standpoint, but that's not something that we're necessarily privy to. So,
sure.
So I'd imagine there is, and I'd say go ahead and ask for it. Ask if there is an actual time frame.
Yeah, probably worth following up with the
it's not necessarily a regulatory time frame under the ADA regulations, so that was a procedural issue.
Sure. One other one. So somebody is asking if the employer refused to provide an interpreter for an interview, I think the question's around sort of who would be responsible for paying for one. Would the applicant, would the responsibility kind of fall onto the applicant to pay for and source an interpreter, or
no,
do they?
Actually,
okay.
If an individual is requesting an interpreter as a means of accommodation in order to participate in the interviewing process, or the hiring process, they can make that request of the employer. The duty then falls on the employer to determine if that's a reasonable accommodation. Now, keep in mind, they may be requesting an interpreter, but an employer can also look at other forms of effective accommodations. So an interpreter is a possible solution, and if that is the most effective option, then the employer may have to consider providing it, and that cost would fall on the employer. However, there can also be other ways of communicating. So if there's other options of communicating for the interview could be effective, then an employer could select an alternative option. The key is that they need to ensure that effective communication takes place. But the individual isn't responsible for paying for accommodations or sourcing the interpreter. Now, if you know that there's a particular interpreting agency that you're comfortable working with, absolutely suggest them. That will cut the time down that it takes for the employer to figure out how to handle all of that. But cost of accommodation falls on the employer.
Great. We still have a couple of minutes, so there's another question here about reasonable accommodation. So I think this person really is, they've asked, can you provide a list of technology resources that can be used to determine what reasonable is? So I guess, is there a definitive list of what is considered reasonable or, unreasonable? Exactly, yeah.
Reasonable is it's kind of an elusive term, but really when I think of reasonable, I think what's really possible. Think of it that way. There cannot be an exhaustive list of that nature because every situation is different. What might be reasonable for one particular employer in one employment situation is going to be different for a different employer in a different employment situation. So there's really no way to provide any sort of comprehensive list like that.
Right. Well, that's great. That's all the questions we have at the minute. If anyone would like to follow up with any further questions, Tracy said that you can contact Jan directly. The contact details are there on the screen. So yeah, we do really encourage you as well to go on to the askjan.org website. You could email, text. They have a live chat on the website as well. So yeah, feel free to follow up if you have any further questions or want to go into a little bit more detail and get some specifics around what your situation is. So yeah, thank you so much to everyone for joining us today, and thank you very much, Tracy. That was really, really useful. And as you mentioned, great. As you mentioned earlier, we are going to be graced with Tracy's presence once again in June. So she will be doing another session on pre-employment questions. So, that'll be really around what employers are allowed and not allowed to ask, and sort of managing situations around the pre-employment stage. So, thank you very much again, Tracy.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you again.
Great. Well, we'll see you then. Hopefully everyone can register for that once the registration's opened. You'll all be emailed that in the Getting Hired newsletter once the registration's open. And thank you again for joining, and have a great rest of your week.
You too. Thanks, Gabby.
Bye-bye.